they do cause some damage when they fall down, or when they are shot down, and especially if they do hit their target, and that will cause fear among the Russian population, and it will look like the Russian military isn't good enough to defend the country's airspace against whatever enters that airspace. And I think this is, Kate, where it becomes really difficult for the Russian leadership. There is a social contract between the leadership and the population, which is, we are waging a war in Ukraine, but here at home you are safe. But if that social contract no longer holds, then it becomes a problem for Putin. If people if the Russian population doesn't think that he can keep them safe from whatever comes from Ukraine or indeed anybody else.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are joined by Elisabeth Braw. She is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on deterrence against emerging forms of aggression, things like hybrid and grey zone threats. She's a columnist and a journalist and is widely read in the Times newspaper on defence. She's also authored a book called The Defender's Dilemma: Defining, Identifying and Deterring Grey Zone Aggression. Elisabeth Braw, welcome to Frontline. Thank you so much for your time. Now, in your recent article for the publication Foreign Policy, you say ships in the Caspian Sea bordered by Russia and Iran, among other countries, they've been switching off their transponders while at sea. You've been watching this closely. Can you just tell me exactly what you found?
Yes, Kate, it's extraordinary. So merchant vessels, and indeed all larger vessels, and that is basically every vessel except the very smallest ones, are supposed to have their automatic identification systems on when they are traveling, because otherwise there is a risk of collision. And that is a safety measure that's been in place for years now, and it also inevitably allows people like me to track where ships are, and then you notice if the AIS is not on, and there can be different reasons for that. For example, technical failure, really bad weather. But when that system, AIS, the automatic identification system, so transponder, as you said, is switched off very frequently on a vessel, then you realize, or for a longer period of time, then you realize that it's not a technical malfunction or bad weather. It can't be bad weather every day of the month or every day of the year. And that's what's happening in the Caspian Sea, where we have seen an extraordinary increase in AIS gaps, as they are called, on Russian vessels and also on Iranian vessels. Iran and Russia are both neighbors of the Caspian Sea, and are, of course, increasingly close geopolitical allies. So an extraordinary increase in AIS gaps on vessels traveling, belonging to Russian or Iranian companies, and traveling between Russia and Iran. And of course raises the question, what is it they want to hide?
Interestingly, there's an increase, as you say, but also when they disappear from detection, how long are they going away for?
They are going away for days at a time. So I'll pull up the figures here and I'll give you an idea. So Russian vessels, for example, and that's where the increase is the most notable. The gaps that last 1 to 3 days, 1 to 3 days is still a long time. In between April and July, it was on average 400 gaps between 1 and 3 days. Then between 4 and 7 days during the same period, it was on average 150 gaps per month. And then there are even gaps lasting up to 14 days, between 8 and 14 days. There was 90, 50, 60, 92 gaps. So still a very significant number of gaps lasting for up to 2 weeks.
Incredible. What do you think is going on? Is it possible that Russia could be using this to supply weapons for its war effort in Ukraine?
I would love to know what it is they're trying to hide. And so there are two possible explanations. One is that they're transporting sanctioned goods that the Russians are not allowed to receive, or that the Iranians are not allowed to receive because it's Western goods. or it could be weapons, and we just don't know what it is. But whatever it is, it's clear that both sides are trying to hide it. And what I should have mentioned earlier, Kate, as well, is that other ships traveling in the Caspian Sea during the same period of time had virtually no AIS gap, so it can't be the weather. And that's why these Russian and Iranian AIS gaps stand out so much, and also because the ships are traveling between Russia and Iran.
It does seem an absolute deliberate effort to evade detection. How is it that they can do this without impunity?
That's right. I mean, this is the I think the downside of the rules-based international order that everybody likes to talk about and to criticize. And actually, if you look at it, the rules-based international order with various UN organizations, organs, various other multilateral bodies that may not be perfect, at least they are there and they set rules. The problem is that there's nobody there who can enforce the rules. And the whole system we've built up since the Second World War is based on countries complying on a voluntary basis. And when they don't comply, we can impose sanctions. But it's very hard to do very much more than imposing sanctions and hope that will force countries into compliance. Well, what if there are a lot of them under sanctions? Then they can start trading amongst themselves, and there isn't really very much we can do. And there is no global police, and in this case in particular, there is no global maritime police, so they just keep doing it.
Have you been getting much response to what you've discovered and what you've analysed?
Yes, it's extraordinary. I've discovered that the whole world is interested in the Caspian Sea. Who knew? But I think it's just it comes as a surprise to a lot of people that this is taking place, and that it's taking place in broad daylight, and that there is really nothing anybody can do about it. And we can all say, oh, they're up to no good, but there is nobody who can do anything about it. And usually when something happens, we'll say, well, the US should do something. But what could the US do? The Caspian Sea is not a global ocean. It's an inland body of water, the world's largest lake. And so even if the US Navy wanted to go there and create some sort of order, it couldn't.
If we could turn our attention now to Russia, and more specifically the war in Ukraine. We've heard reports of increasing infighting in the Russian defense establishment. There's been mounting pressure from generals to the defense minister Shoigu, and another round of mobilization being pushed for. Meanwhile, on the front, soldiers are reportedly frustrated by equipment shortages. Does President Putin have unlimited support for this war, do you think?
No, he doesn't. And I think even at the early stages of the war, even before the war, it was unclear what sort of support he had. But this is the limitation of an autocracy or an autocratic system. People don't speak their minds because they know they'll be fired or fall out of windows. So what they do instead is say what they think pleases the boss, in this case, Putin. And that's what happened with the Ukraine war. Either Russia's military intelligence is really bad, which I don't think is the case, or Russian military intelligence deliberately told Putin what he wanted to hear, namely that an invasion of Ukraine would be a cakewalk. And that's why Russia is where it is today, bogged down in this war that I thought it could win within days. And the thing is, as everybody knows, success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan, and that is what's becoming clear now in Russia. If it turned out to be a cakewalk, this war, then everything would have been nice and harmonious within the higher and indeed lower ranks of the military. But when now that things are going very slowly and indeed maybe regressing because Ukraine is making incremental advances in its counteroffensive, then people will become defensive, so to speak, and will start blaming their colleagues. And nobody will own up to the failures, especially since they may not have believed in this war in the first place. So it's a sort of a Lord of the Flies situation, which develops in any situation where people are cornered, which is the case now, and indeed where they felt they couldn't speak their minds at the beginning. And that's exactly, if I may add, that's exactly what happened to Nazi Germany after the invasion of Russia or the
And if
Soviet
you
Union.
And if you throw into all of this the number of drone attacks that are taking in place inside Russia itself, there's been another drone attack on Moscow this morning, and the British Ministry of Defence is saying it's likely that these kind of attacks are coming from within Russia. What kind of effect is that kind of thing having on the people itself?
I was reminded this morning of Matthias Rust, the German teenager who landed a little Cessna aircraft next to the Kremlin in 1987. I think those of us who were alive in 1987 still remember that moment vividly. There he was, an idealistic German teenager who thought he was creating an air bridge between the East and the West. But what he did was he completely embarrassed the Soviet military because he had been able to fly through all their air defenses and land there in front of the Kremlin. And I think the same sort of embarrassment is happening now. Yes, the Russians are able to shoot down these drones, but the drones they just keep coming. It's not just one or two. Now it has been a string of them, and they do cause some damage when they fall down, or when they are shot down, and especially if they do hit their target, and that will cause fear among the Russian population, and it will look like the Russian military isn't good enough to defend the country's airspace against whatever enters that airspace. And I think this is, Kate, where it becomes really difficult for the Russian leadership. There is a social contract between the leadership and the population, which is, we are waging a war in Ukraine, but here at home you are safe. But if that social contract no longer holds, then it becomes a problem for Putin. If people if the Russian population doesn't think that he can keep them safe from whatever comes from Ukraine or indeed anybody else.
I suppose the other argument could be, though, that this is proof that Ukraine is a threat to us. That's the way that President Putin could spin it in order to strengthen support for his war against Ukraine.
Indeed, and that's why I think Ukraine has not said that it's behind these drone attacks, and we can speculate, we can assume that it is Ukraine, but we actually don't know. It could also be some sort of groups affiliated with Ukraine. But yes, as you say, Kate, that will help that narrative. But I think at the end of the day, Russians want the convenience of being able to lead their daily lives, being able to buy whatever they want. And the moment that promise to them from the government is broken, then they may say, well, this war against Ukraine is just not worth it. Now we are feeling inconvenienced. And on top of that, more men will have to be mobilized. And so that's a further inconvenience.
Let's return to the sea for a moment. Russia's blockade of Ukrainian ports continues after they pulled out of that Black Sea grain deal, and Russia released footage of a ship being boarded after warning shots had been fired. Does that kind of thing set a dangerous precedent?
Yes, it does. And what's so crucial about global shipping is that it has to be able to function without interference, because if shipping companies, management companies, insurers, if they perceive that there is a risk of interference, then it doesn't become worth shipping along that route anymore, which is why it was so important that Western countries stepped in and helped shipping companies, helped protect ships off the Horn of Africa against Somali pirates. Now, pirates are easier to handle than nation-state attacks on ships. And on the same note, the US Navy and Marine Corps have just sent 3,000 sailors and Marines to the Strait of Hormuz to keep shipping there safe from Iranian attacks and harassment. And that really raises a question: is the corridor that Ukraine is envisaging through the Black Sea as an alternative to the grain corridor, which is of course no more, is it safe enough, not just from the perspective of the Ukrainian military, but from the perspective of shipping companies and insurers and indeed of captains?
Yeah, and Ukraine does say that there has been a successful passage of the Hong Kong flagged container ship, and there will be more to come that will follow through. How much do you think that what happens at sea will impact on the war and the direction in which it progresses in Ukraine?
Yeah, so Ukraine needs this new shipping corridor to work, and it has said that it's working with that its military will protect any ships going through this corridor, and yes, that is fine. The problem, though, or the challenge is, will shipping companies will they be comfortable sailing under those circumstances, even if insurance companies agree to underwrite it? Will shipping companies consider that a safe enough situation, considering that, as you said, Russia has said it will treat commercial shipping in these parts of the Black Sea as legitimate targets, a legitimate target, and so there are two conflicting views here: the Russian view and the Ukrainian view, and in the middle are the shipping companies that are absolutely indispensable if the world is going to get Ukrainian grain. And I would hate to be the person who decides whether or not to send my ship through that corridor. As you said, Kate, one ship has been able to pass safely, but does that prove that it's safe, or was it just an aberration? We just don't know.
You've written extensively about the idea of grey zone attacks, whereby states can use tactics short of war against others, such as disrupting global shipping and economies, or cyber attacks, for example. Are we likely to see a rise, do you think, in these kinds of attacks, and not just from Russia?
Oh, definitely, and it's happening every day. I must say, in the years that I've been working on grey zone aggression, or rather watching it, it has grown in intensity and in the number of ways that countries use grey zone aggression against other countries. Used to be mostly cyber and disinformation. Now, in recent months and years, has included weaponization of migrants, targeting of Western companies as proxies for the home government, and anything in between. And what we have seen what we saw just before Russia invaded Ukraine was that you can turn a country into a failed economy simply by pretending that you'll invade, and that is not a military action. Russia just had its soldiers on the border, and that spooked investors, FDI investors, money markets, financial markets massively, and there was nothing Ukraine could do really. Then, of course, Russia invaded and became a hot war. But just in recent days, actually, I should say recent months, Iran has been harassing commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz linked to the US. And that is grey zone aggression. What can you do about that? It's not an act of war, but still it frightens global shipping in that crucial body of water. And even in the past couple of days, China has announced that it has discovered some sort of pests or dangerous organisms in Taiwanese mangoes. And we should remember that mangoes are one of Taiwan's most famous agricultural exports. Now China is suspending imports of Taiwanese mangoes because they're supposedly found mysterious organisms in them. And that is in response, clearly in response to a US visit by Taiwan's vice president. And China regularly does this. When a Taiwanese politician does something China doesn't like, it doesn't say, well, now we'll hit back against you. It targets Taiwan's economy. It has done it already with pineapples, and now it's mangoes. The same thing has happened to Australian wine, as I think your listeners will remember. People responded by buying even more Australian wine.
It's incredible when you kind of describe the breadth of the way grey zone attacks can be carried out. Which countries do you think are taking it the most seriously and are the best prepared to defend themselves against it? And what should they be doing?
No country has perfect grey zone defense, simply because it's so hard to keep up with the different ways. Finland, for example, has very good information literacy training for in its school system. That is one area of gray zone aggression that Finland is tackling very well. The Czech Republic, their Ministry of Defense exercises various gray zone scenarios with companies. Singapore has very good public information or public awareness campaigns. Sweden has a new psychological defense agency that is very good at quickly picking up malign influence campaigns that are being directed against Sweden, which was a good thing this summer when a massive malign influence campaign was launched against Sweden. And so there are various best practices, but no country has the perfect defense against gray zone aggression. I should also mention Australia. They are trying really hard.
It's really interesting that you mentioned education because as the school term is about to start again, we hear that Russia is going to be introducing new textbooks for Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine, for example, and in Russia itself to indoctrinate the young people about its views on Ukraine and the war in Ukraine.
It's good and it's heartening and disheartening to see how big the potential is to bring things into children's thinking, and a child's mind is just so it can absorb anything, which is a wonderful thing to see when you have children, even when you don't have children. But then on the other hand, if they absorb aggressive kind of content or indeed incorrect kind of content, falsehoods, then it's very hard to correct that. And we should remember that this is not new. During the Cold War, textbooks in the Warsaw Pact Warsaw Pact countries were not exactly accurate, but they realized that this was the way of creating a new kind of person.
Now, if we return to the weaponry of the war in Ukraine, yesterday President Zelensky was in Denmark to see the F-16 jets that are being sent from Denmark and the Netherlands. How significant is this continuing support for Ukraine from NATO, especially Europe, or is it too little too late?
It's an extraordinary step, really. As your listeners and viewers will remember, Ukraine has been asking for Western fighter jets since the beginning of this war, and it's extraordinary, really, the length of how the Western approach to what to deliver to Ukraine has changed throughout these months of the war. I think everybody remembers when Germany at the beginning of the war was so hesitant to send anything that it settled on sending helmets. Now it has agreed to send tanks, and that was a big step when Germany decided to do that. And fighter jets are the next step. And Denmark happens to have F-16s that it can retire because it's buying F-35. So these F-16s are becoming available, and it's a very generous act to donate them to Ukraine, which is what Denmark has decided to do. The Netherlands too will send some of its F-16s to Ukraine, although it hasn't said whether it's donating or selling them. But it's important. It's hugely important from a military perspective, and also because these two countries are essentially breaking the ceiling and saying we dare to do this, because there's been this fear all along that, if we donate fighter jets, the Russians will retaliate. And now these two countries are saying we're going to have a go, and that will make it easier for other F-16 countries to donate theirs as they get their F-35s.
Of course, the war in Ukraine has encouraged your country, Sweden, your home country, Sweden, to take a big step, which was to apply to join NATO. How soon is that really likely to happen?
It was supposed to be in October. Well, it was supposed to be months ago. Then it was supposed to be by the time the Vilnius summit took place. And then it was delayed further. And the reason, of course, is that Turkey has put up various demands. And originally, when Sweden applied, it was one set of demands, and those demands changed. But this July, President Erdogan finally agreed to submit Sweden's membership to Parliament for ratification in October. And I must say, even then, I thought, well, a lot can happen between July and October, and now that has come to pass. Unfortunately, there was this massive anger campaign against Sweden, fueled by Russian social media accounts and indeed Arabic language social media accounts over the Quran burning that was perpetrated by an Iraqi refugee in June, and that led to enormous anger that I think was not just I think that was something that Russia wanted to see. That enormous anger then created not just violence in Iraq against the Swedish embassy, but indeed a heightened terror alert within Sweden itself. And now, sorry to make this story a bit longer, Kate, but the point is that now there is this heightened terror alert in Sweden. There are people who are well, there are very many unhappy people in Sweden of different persuasions, and now President Erdogan has said that the security on the streets, in the streets of Sweden, is a concern for him, and he's linking that to the ratification of Sweden's NATO membership. So I must say, this feels like such an engineered campaign against Sweden, especially when you consider how active Russian language accounts were in spreading falsehoods about that Quran burning and in whipping up anger against Sweden. And that's where we are now. Now Erdogan says, well, considering the security situation in Sweden, I don't know about NATO membership ratification. And how can a country possibly join NATO if this sort of these goalposts will constantly be shifted, and countries will keep interfering through falsehoods and malign influence campaigns? How can a country join NATO or come to any sort of agreement or political decision? It really is very difficult being a liberal democracy today. Sorry to be so negative, Kate. Oh, I think it will, and President Erdogan obviously holds a trump card because he has to send the application for ratification to the parliament. But he is also just one of many leaders within NATO, and I think his fellow NATO leaders at some point will say, "Well, you have been playing this game for a very long time now, and we are not going to be very happy with you." Of course, they can't force him, but he is the leader of a country that is not particularly strong economically, and I hope his fellow leaders can make the case that it really is. He really should do the right thing, but. With leaders like him, unfortunately, it's all in the head of that leader. You can't sort of judge from various outside parameters whether he will do or not do something, which is what makes this so unpredictable.
And just finally, Elisabeth, how do you think that the war in Ukraine has changed the way that not only Sweden but other Scandinavian countries think about their security and the security of Europe?
It is extraordinary. It has been extraordinary to watch Finland in particular, where the support for NATO membership among the population used to be around the mid-20s, around 24%. And it was that way all the way up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then it skyrocketed. It was really, I've never seen public support for anything shift like it did in Finland with regards to NATO membership. And so it went up to 68%, even 70%. And that's, of course, what then convinced Finland's politicians to say, well, if our voters, if the population wants to join NATO, well, then we'll submit a NATO membership bid. And then Sweden also essentially had to submit a membership bid that the government then didn't want to join. But if Finland joined, what could Sweden do? And public support in Sweden in favor of NATO membership also shifted. So that's Sweden and Finland, really an extraordinary change. But when we look at Denmark, I mean, Denmark is a small country, and it has found its voice in giving these F-16s to Ukraine. So this is and same thing with Norway, which has donated tanks to Ukraine, and is in fact training the Ukrainians on these Leopard tanks, and it's a moment where the Nordic countries are really coming into their own, or have been coming into their own, and discovering that there are things they can do without being followers. And a good example of that, just to finish up this point or this thought, a good example of that is what Sweden is doing, has promised Ukraine it will do. A good example of that is the agreement between Ukraine and Sweden that was signed just a couple of days ago, where Sweden agreed to have its companies jointly produce the CV-90, a fantastic Swedish combat vehicle, in Ukraine. This is the first such example where a key piece of weaponry will be produced in Ukraine, even as the war is taking place there. It will be produced in Ukraine, involving Swedish and Ukrainian companies. It is a fantastic step, and the first step of its kind. I think it really is a good example of what even smaller countries can do. Now, 10 million people, that's not a tiny country, but it's not as big as the UK or Germany or the US. And I think that also shows that other larger countries could learn from these somewhat smaller Nordic countries.
Elisabeth Braw, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much for joining us on Frontline. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.